going spurt, stop, spurt, stop. And that means in between hard contractions, we'd be alert, then not, and alert, then not, and then alert, and then not. And then I would say, well, that's pretty typical for one of my lectures. I see a lot of that. Mean arterial pressure. When we say the word mean in algebra, what does that mean? Average. So that's what this word is meaning here too. Average arterial pressure. All blood vessels have a blood pressure. Why do we give a rat's whisker about the artery? They're the closest to the heart. That is where the pressure gradient is going to be the strongest. That's our indicator of driving force. How well will the tissues be perfused? Now, is this going to be a true average? Will you take systolic pressure and diastolic pressure and add them together and divide by 2? That is a true average if you were taking those two pressures. We're not going to take a true average. Mean arterial pressure is a slightly skewed, weighted average. We're going to give more emphasis to diastolic pressure. Why? The heart is in diastole longer than systole. And therefore, the pressure during diastole should have more weight associated with it. So to calculate mean arterial pressure, you would take your systolic pressure and multiply that by 0.4. You would then take your diastolic pressure and multiply that by 0.6. Once you've done the multiplication, then you can add those two values together. And that will give you your mean arterial pressure. Now, if you do that calculation with a traditional 120/80, and you do that skewed calculation, you will get a pressure, a mean arterial pressure of about 96 millimeters of mercury. Now, most textbooks, what do they do with that? They round it up to 100. And that's where students get sidetracked, think 120 and 180 divided by 2, I get 100. And it's really technically not 100. It's 96 millimeters of mercury, or 96 torr. What happens to the other 4 torr? Well, we don't care unless you're Abraham Lincoln, 4 torr and 7 years ago. So I'm just going to go for that. So, it is not a true, that's a really bad physiologist joke, by the way. It's one that they use at parties, and it goes about as well as it did here.
Not letting you go parties anymore?
Yeah. I'm not good in a social setting. I'm really not. As the Tuesday class well knows. Bruises on my leg from being kicked. Okay, so, pressure. Pressure change, delta P. That's in our numerator for Ohm's law. It is an indicator of a driving force to get blood to go through vessels. This is Kara having fun with PowerPoint. This is a kitty. Good, see? I can play Pictionary. This is the renal artery, and this is the renal vein. We have an average, I rounded up, 100 millimeters of mercury worth of blood pressure coming in through the renal artery, and let's say there's 0 coming out of the renal vein. What's the pressure gradient or change? 100. We take the difference between the two. What would happen if the venous pressure went up? There would be less of a pressure gradient, and that means less blood flow. Well, that's important for this week's lab. Tuesday class, you already had this. Thursday class, you will. If we have an elevated pressure in the right atrium, then that means we're going to have reduced venous return, reduced driving force. And venous return is also a flow. It's the amount of blood, milliliters, in a given amount of time returning to the heart. Cardiac output is how much blood we eject. What we eject, we should get back, correct? So if you have an increased venous pressure, an increased pressure in the right atrium, it's supposed to be 0, but let's say it goes up to 20, that's going to be a reduced driving force systemically. And that means you're going to have blood accumulating in the peripheral veins. It's not going to be returning very well to the heart, and the patient will experience edema. All right, so the large veins coming back to the heart, they have about 2 millimeters of mercury worth of pressure. The right atrium, it goes down to 0.
Karen, quick question about that. Why is it 0.4 or 0.6?
Because diastole of the heart lasts longer than systole. Diastole lasts 430 milliseconds. Systole lasts 370. So it's not 50-50, right? So more time is spent in diastole, therefore we give more emphasis to the diastolic pressure. And again, just to point this out, notice that in both my examples of the kidneys there, I kept resistance, strike that. Notice in both the kidneys, I kept resistance unchanged. There was the same amount of resistance. I only changed the pressure gradient, which then reflected that I had changes in blood flow. This is important, like I said, for this week. You're going to be playing with central venous pressure. Central venous pressure, technically defined, is the pressure in the right atrium. It should be 0 millimeters of mercury. And as I told the Tuesday class, if you say 0 pressure to a physicist anywhere in the body, they're going to say, can't happen, because there's atmospheric pressure all around us. A physiologist subtracts that background pressure. So what we're saying is the pressure in the right atrium is the same as atmospheric pressure, no difference, so it's 0. The amount of pressure generated by the left side of the heart to get blood to be ejected through the aorta, as you just saw, has a mean arterial pressure of about 96 millimeters of mercury. So 96 to get the blood out, 0 in the right atrium. This is a very large pressure gradient to allow blood to flow from the elastic arteries to muscular arteries, to arterioles, to capillaries, to venules, to veins, to the vena cava, and back to the right atrium. All through those blood vessels, we are having progressive drops in pressure, with ultimately 0 being in the right atrium. Throughout the entire systemic circuit, we have a driving force to keep blood flowing from out of the heart and back to the heart. If central venous pressure were to go up, say, to 20, just like the pressure went up in the renal vein in the previous slide, then that means we would have reduced pressure gradient. Reduced changes in pressure means reduced flow. That means reduced venous return. That means that blood's accumulating somewhere in the periphery, and we should expect to see edema occur in our patient. A person with elevated central venous pressure will have blood damming up in their veins. You will see bulging neck veins, even when they're sitting up. Your veins are not bulging right now in your neck. The reason is when you sit up, gravity is helping drain the blood from your head, and it's going to the superior vena cava and to the right atrium of the heart. But what would it tell me if your veins were bulging out of your neck? Some of those large vessels leading back to the heart are either occluded or central venous pressure is elevated, less venous return, and the veins are just holding that blood. They're the capacitance vessels. In lab this week, Tuesday class, you tested central venous pressure, simulated, I should say, elevated central venous pressure by performing the Valsalva maneuver. I cannot say this enough. That was a simulation. You were falsely presenting as if you were a patient with elevated central venous pressure. You were trying to mimic what it looks like to have increased peripheral venous pressure, the damming up of blood, the bulging veins. In actuality, when you were performing the Valsalva maneuver to bulge your veins in the periphery, your venous return to the right atrium was decreased, and in actuality, your central venous pressure was going down. So please, you need to keep the simulation separate from the reality, the real condition. In a person with elevated central venous pressure, their CVP is higher than 0, and they are getting the peripheral edema. The peripheral venous pressure is going up. In you, healthy individuals performing the Valsalva maneuver, you mimicked the increase in peripheral venous pressure, but in actuality, your central venous pressure was going down. This is making a lot more sense for the Tuesday class than the Thursday class, but by the time you get there, this will be all ironed out. How can we get an increase in central venous pressure? What if someone is getting an IV and the flow rate is way, way, way too high? Do you know what they present with? They will have increased blood pressure, but you'll know the flow rate is too high for the body to accommodate. You will see the bulging neck veins. They will have an increase in CVP. Increased venous tone. If suddenly the veins were to put more squeeze on the blood inside, you would get more increase in venous return. And before the heart contracted to accommodate that, you would have an increase in central venous pressure, more expansion in the right atrium. If the arterioles were to dilate and get more blood flowing through them to the capillary beds, to the veins, you would get more blood pushing back to the heart. Again, these are examples to reflect down here, more venous return. We know in a healthy heart, on the very next beat, the heart will contract with a greater vigor, greater force of contraction to get that blood in, right back out. So I'm talking in a snapshot of time. If you have more venous return because you decide I'm going to start working out, well, yes, your central venous pressure would go up temporarily, but on the next beat, your heart should be able to compensate for that. It's in patients that have ventricular failure, right ventricular failure, weak, flaccid heart, where their heart is not able to compensate, and the blood does get dammed up, and their CVP remains elevated long-term. Valves of the heart on the right side. If the tricuspid or right atrioventricular valve is faulty and everts, then blood will be squeezed from the right ventricle back to the right atrium. That also will increase central venous pressure. You now have blood going back to the right atrium, being met with blood trying to return from the body, right? And that means less venous return, more peripheral venous pressure, more edema. You need a break.